So this is about the Haida Gwaii, right? And the land. Remember you were talking about how this goes here? This is from Rebel News. Now, do you remember we did that episode with Baboys and Sherry and we were talking
Yeah.
about the land a bit, like, and the fear mongering. So I would think this might fall into that category of like what they think is like fear mongering about the private property. But I want to know what you think about it.
Wondering what this Haida Land Act agreement is going to mean to them, especially when it comes to private property. Now, I saw what you were talking about on Twitter, X, and that's why I reached out to you. You have definite insight here. So, for those who are not quite familiar, tell us a little bit about this agreement.
Sure. So this week, the NDP government is about to pass the Haida Title Act. It will recognize, for the first time in history, Haida Aboriginal title over roughly 10,000 square
So check out this
kilometers
map here.
on Haida Gwaii, and relinquish British Columbia's control over land and resources in that territory. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that
Relinquish British Columbia's control over that land and resources.
every single tenure and permit that was granted without the Haida's consent in the past is now in jeopardy. It means that every home and piece of private property, is now uncertain because, contrary to what the NDP has said repeatedly, the agreement does not clearly protect private property rights. And you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe John Rustad, the leader of the Conservative Party of BC. Talk to Tom Isaac. He's a nationally renowned Aboriginal law scholar for decades. He's written 12 books. He's been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. He's written a memo on this agreement and says it does not adequately protect private property. In fact, it has conflicting provisions, which include a recognition of Haida title over fee simple lands. So it's not clear whether in the coming days and years, the Haida will assume title over private property, if they will assume control, if they will change the management. In fact, the agreement does contemplate the deregistering of private property by the Haida, the private property they accumulate through different means. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns about this agreement. And one more I should mention is that, what does it mean when you have Haida leaders taking the place of British Columbia leaders on the island? Well, it means that half of the population who are not members of the Haida Nation will now be ruled by leaders that they do not elect. This is within Canada.
And that concern over people who are unelected.
What
now-
about Indians
know
right
if
now
that's
living
good.
under? What about 650 Indian bands in Canada right now being under the rule of people they didn't elect?
They didn't vote?
Well, maybe they voted, but they don't have any choice for their own governance.
No, I know. And I mean, how bad
The
is it
deal's
when
not
I'm
that
like,
we get to vote for some white dude to run the place? That's not what the fucking treaties say.
but
I
how
mean,
bad?
I don't know enough about this one to weigh in personally, but I mean, buying unceded land would have been a risk, especially out in BC where there's no treaties yet. It's going to get interesting out there.
What do you mean? Okay, you got to explain what you mean by that.
Well,
Buying
because
unceded
most
land.
of the fucking country is treated out, but BC's not. There's a giant chunks of BC that no treaties have ever been signed.
Oh, okay. So okay,
So
that's
it
different.
gets
Okay.
weird, which I'm assuming this whole area here is. I mean, I don't know that I don't know how to lean in on it. You know what I mean? But
No, but okay, but how weird is it that it doesn't even like worry me that you're gonna have non-elected leaders. I mean, the elected leaders are a fucking joke right now. Like I almost feel like that would be a nice change for once. Having
Yeah.
somebody that has to, it's almost in some ways better that you're not elected, because then if people don't like it, like they won't put up with it. But let me just see if there's anything else in here, and then I want to show you a map.
Decision-making power per se over Crown land came up in a report we did about the BC Land Act that the NDP government seemed to have wanted to quietly pass, but has now parked temporarily and got much pushback. But that BC Land Act is part of sort of a commitment to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in BC, we adopted DRIPA. So, how do those two things tie in with this Haida agreement?
Right. So that's a really important place to start. So UNDRIP was passed in 2007 and then adopted by Canada in 2010. It essentially says that all lands traditionally used, occupied, or otherwise acquired by Indigenous peoples will be returned, and or compensation
The-
paid
Keep
in
it
lieu,
playing. Keep it
and that
playing.
Indigenous laws will be
Start it over. Go back
applied
a bit.
on all the lands that Indigenous people.
adopted
Yeah, that's important. That's
DRIPA.
an important
So
point if it's
how do
true.
those two things tie in with this HIDA agreement?
Right. So that's a really important place to start. So UNDRIP was passed in 2007 and then adopted by Canada in 2010. It essentially says that all lands traditionally used, occupied, or otherwise acquired by Indigenous peoples will be returned, and or compensation paid in lieu, and
Okay,
that
so there.
Indigenous
Or
laws will
compensation paid in
be
lieu.
applied on all the lands that Indigenous peoples control. So that's the blueprint from UNDRIP. And then in 2019, the British Columbia government, the NDP government, said we are going to make this domestic law. We're going to make this legally binding in BC. So for the last 5 years, that's what they've been busy doing, is taking this vision of an elite racial minority controlling the lands within British Columbia and applying it across every sector of British Columbian economy and society.
What do they mean by? What does he mean by an elite racial minority?
Well, he's saying that the Indians are an elite racial minority. I mean,
Okay.
it's a pretty fucking ballsy thing to say for people that own no land that you've had under your thumb for 150 years. Maybe he hasn't personally, but what is his solution? That the Indians just don't get shit?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds political to me that he's pushing back from the NDP, but I mean, what when you said
You need a
buying
solution.
this,
You need a solution. You can't just, you don't get to fucking keep everything, keep all the
well, I
money
mean,
and
we
nothing
got to
get
listen
shit.
to the rest of it if we're going to blame. He might have a solution. I don't know. So I don't want to say he doesn't have one because we're cutting it off here halfway through. But I mean, we can keep listening to it if you want. But I want to go back to what you said about selling unceded land. So are you saying that people that have bought property, let's say on the Haida Gwaii Islands or in other places in BC, if there's no treaty,
Yeah, who
that
did
they
they
might
buy
be,
it from?
um, why couldn't the government, the BC NDP government, just have said, here, take your Haida Gwaii, but if people have purchased the land already, you like that's not part of it. Like if a settler has purchased the land from whoever it is, can't they just leave them out of that? Like why would they even risk private property being included in this? Do you think would the Indigenous peoples care that much that the small section of private property on that huge island has been purchased by people?
I don't know.
Like
I don't know. It's
it
not
doesn't
really
wouldn't it
my
make
place
sense
to
you would
say.
say like we got to start like somewhere fresh, like have all of it but except for what people bought? I mean, it seems crazy that you would just overlook that.
And then who do they pay taxes to?
Well, I mean, who know? I mean, I guess they would just pay taxes to the whoever takes ownership of that place, right? Or whoever takes over it, I guess.
Because as far as I'm concerned, you can have your private property, but now it's in a different nation. Is what
Yeah.
it boils
Yeah, yeah,
down
yeah,
to at
yeah,
the
yeah.
end of the
That's
day.
at least you've still got it. I mean, like at least it's you feel like somewhat secure in it now. So here's an interesting map because it's you talk about all this all the time, right? The crown lands compared to the private lands, right? What is it?
Mhm.
90? What is the percentage again?
Yeah, 89%
90,
government
yeah.
land.
So here's BC. This is what BC looks like. So that would be Haida Gwaii up there. That's Vancouver Island. So most of Vancouver Island's private, and then you've got Vancouver, of course, and then all the parts of the
Most
Okanagan
of
and the east.
Vancouver Island is crown, over half,
Oh,
way over
there's a
half.
pretty big chunk though there of private, right? So all
Yeah,
that's
probably
like really what
30%.
that's not very accessible, that area. I mean, it's really quite mountainous and hilly, and you know that's the problem is a lot of what's left is not really, I mean, not as settleable, obviously.
True.
The left has never understood why property rights are a big deal, except to fat cats who own a lot of property. Thomas Sowell. I find it really strange that that book I read, that Utopia, that was also one of the main things that Utopia was talking about was abolishing private property. That's still a big thing, and I just you know now that I'm in a different stage of my life, like I want something of my own that I can just make my own and not have not have to live under somebody else's um, ownership. Should I play a bit more of that, or is that enough?
That's probably enough.
Okay.
Yeah, it's gonna get interesting over there. It's gonna get interesting. I mean, most of Ontario and the places where these treaties are, there's no people. I mean, that's like all of northwestern Ontario, where my treaty is. It goes all the way from basically where my hometown is to right to Hudson's Bay.
How would I find out about that?
What do you mean find out?
Where the BC treaty land is?
I don't know. I'm sure you could find some sort of map, but like I say, most of BC is not ceded.
Interesting.
So there's no treaties. The numbered treaties like stop almost at the Alberta border.
And that's why BC is taking on this UNDRIP problem.
That's why BC's got way more problems than everyone else but I mean, for example, you could take a look at this. This is like the Ontario map. So when the treaties were signed, and I mean, maybe those don't mean shit to you, maybe it don't matter, but the deals were made. Deals were made, and it wasn't. So this was sort of the extent of Treaty 9. So Treaty 9 here, what the treaties basically state is that these lands here with the purple here and the blue, that's my treaty. That's Treaty 9, Mishkegowgaming right here. That's my reserve. This is all our traditional territory. So I guess technically we don't own it, but it's ours as long as the grass grows. It's ours to use as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, is what they said. The first two are in Manitoba. Treaty 3 is here. This is my hometown right here.
So can I just show you a map now that's exact? Okay, actually finish up what you're doing there. Sorry, Red Lake, there's your town there, yeah.
Yeah. So there's Treaty 3, Treaty 45, Treaty 29, Treaty 6, Treaty 12. So I mean, we could have just, I don't know how they could have done it, but at the time they signed legal documents that said that this was going to happen. And these are what the lawsuits are coming up in Ontario over now, is that, you guys have pulled $2 trillion worth of
right
resources out of this shit. And the treaty says we're supposed to be splitting it.
Right. So I was looking at these Google Maps in Alberta and BC, and I was seeing these little squares in here, which is the reservations, or the reserves, I guess. Right? Is that what? So here's that area that you just showed, right? Of that, that's your treaty here, right? That's where the Polar Bear Provincial Park is, that Hudson's Bay, right? But these are the reserves. These that like Fort Hope thing there. If I zoom right in, I believe that's a reserve. Yeah. So, and then that's a reserve. So how come? So even though you have treaty rights of that land, you still have the reserves here that are just very small, right? I mean, these are the reserve. These are the size of the reserve.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. So when you look at my map, that's the land that they said we could, you can fish, you can hunt, you can use all the stuff from it, and it'll be yours to hunt and fish or do whatever on for all time. But you motherfuckers got to live in this little box, and you don't own that.
Interesting. So they really said like you got to live on those reserves?
Yeah. And for a long time you weren't allowed to leave them without their permission.
Oh, but then something changed where they could assimilate. So that would be the one closest to where you grew up, I guess, right? Or
well,
actually,
I think you could always sort of, you could assimilate in. You could give up but at that time you would have to give up all of your treaty rights. So you would give up basically anything you had that said you were an Indian, pretty much.
Interesting.
You weren't an Indian anymore.
Oh, I see. That's when you're fully assimilated or whatever. Did you know Google Maps had all the reserves on there?
Yes. Yeah.
I wonder if in BC. So in BC they don't have those then, right? Or do they? Yeah, they do. Yeah, they still do. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not sure. I haven't spent enough time in BC.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Yeah, Chehalis and all that. Yeah, okay.
So some of it is reserved and stuff. There's a huge. It's a Wet'suwet'en or whatever that they have a huge thing too. There's definitely giant chunks of BC that have never signed treaties. But I couldn't tell you. I mean, they just sort of stopped once they got out there. They kind of stopped caring once they had. I mean, I was going down a rabbit hole today about when Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't even really want to be part of Canada. They wanted to do their own thing called Buffalo.
Right.
That would have been great, right?
Yeah.
Would have been fantastic.
Well, because that sort of territorialism, or I don't know, almost like a governmental racism from the east to the west was happening way back then, right? I mean, did you see those cartoons about how bad the east was treating Alberta and Saskatchewan even back then?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a big reason that a lot of those treaties were written pretty hastily because they were in a giant rush to get out west before the U.S. took it. The U.S. had eyes on it. And they probably would have taken it if it wasn't for them.